Hello, listener. Hello. Welcome to Black Tower Storycraft. It's mighty hot here in the bayou. Mighty hot and humid. You can hear the crickets, of course, singing their grating, horrid song. I'm glad you found your way here and didn't perish along the way. I hope you enjoy these stories. I hope they help you beat the heat. Perhaps the mosquitos won't bother you as much, too. There's plenty of chairs here. No, you aren't allowed inside. You must sit here. Plenty of chairs, as I said. Plenty of chairs. So pick one, not near me, and sit and listen.
Hoia Baciu Forest. My grandmother was Romanian, and she had some of the scariest damn stories I've ever heard. We only visited her twice when I was very young, but this story she told me has stuck with me to this very day. She lived along a remote road surrounded by farmland and some homes. One day we were walking to her neighbor's farm when we passed by a field that led up to a large forest. I remember my grandmother was walking with determination when I asked her why a little girl in the woods was waving at us. She told me to keep my eyes on the road and continued walking, but I didn't. This time the girl was beckoning to me and then pointing into the woods. I tugged on my grandmother's shirt, and she grabbed my hand angrily and continued walking faster to her neighbor's house. Once we got inside her neighbor's house, I asked again, "Who was that girl, grandmother?" Her eyes got wide, and she excused herself to make some tea. My grandmother hesitated before telling me the story of her youngest sister, Joanna. My youngest sister was a beautiful girl like yourself. She was full of energy and was always disappearing to go exploring. As a child, our mother told us we were never to go into the forest alone, if it could be avoided to do so. Joanna came to me one morning with a mischievous smile and asked if we could take a walk. We walked along our dirt road until it hit the edge of the woods. I suggested we turn back, and she simply smiled and continued walking. I called to her to come back, but she ignored me and continued moving deeper into the woods. I grabbed up my skirt and chased after her, calling her name into the woods. She continued to run deeper and deeper into the forest. I followed closely behind her as I could, but the woods seemed to grow darker and thicker with each step. Eventually, I could not even see her tiny white body against the green and browns of the forest, and I noticed the sky was growing dark. I knew we'd only been running for a short amount of time, yet somehow the day was gone. The sun was hiding beneath the canopy of the trees, and I not only knew it was getting dark, but that I had no idea where I was. I called for Joanna once again, but no sound came, and it was then that I realized the silence of the forest, unlike any I had heard before. I felt the panic creep up my spine, and I began running back from where I had come. Yet I slowed when I saw again the pale white against the darkness of the wood. I saw off the trail was a large clearing. I don't know how I could have ran past it without noticing it before. The clearing was large and barren and seemed to be in the shape of a giant circle, and standing in its midst was my sister. She was smiling in her white dress, mud staining the bottom. and her tiny white hand clutched a tall man, if you could call him that. He was thin and pale like the trees marked by fire. He wore a black suit that seemed oddly large on his thin, harsh bones, and he held my sister's hand and a long golden pocket watch in the other. The watch glinted under the sunlight, and I put my hand up to block the reflection of its rays. When I awoke, I was alone in the field, and the morning sun was beginning to rise above the trees. I was cold and covered with dew, and frost cracked beneath my feet as I went to stand. The woods remained silent, and yet I felt that I was not alone. My sister never came home, so that is why you must never go into the woods. Perhaps it was my childhood imagination or the setting of the Romanian wilderness, but the story has always stuck with me. My grandmother died when I was 10, and we did not get to travel to her grave until I was 17 years old. She was buried on a beautiful hill that had one large tree and was surrounded by the farms she loved so dearly. We took a taxi to where her old home had been, and as we drove past those woods, I saw something. It appeared to be that young girl in the white dress, yet this time my grandmother stood beside her, holding her hand. It all happened so quickly I can't be sure, but the feeling stuck with me when my mother let out a deep sigh and said, "I still can't believe she had a heart attack in those woods, of all the places," and shifted uncomfortably in her chair.
My father punished me when I talked to ghosts. By E. Crow.
I've been blind since I was born. As I grew up, everything was described to me in such vivid detail I didn't even realize why it was that important to see, especially having no reference point to compare it. We lived on a single-floor ranch house. That's what Father told me. In my mind I could see, of course, although unlike how a sighted person could. I had spatial awareness. I knew where my bedroom was, the bathroom, the living room, and the kitchen. Each wall had its own texture. I don't know if that was done on purpose, or that I could feel things others never noticed. I rarely fell over, only if Father or another of the visitors put something somewhere they shouldn't. It was usually the visitors, and Dad would shout. They visited infrequently, though not for long. Father said I shouldn't speak to them, that it unsettled him. He'd worry when I saw something he didn't, saw it with my ears or by touch. Ellie was the first. She seemed very sweet. She asked me my name and why my face was so messed up. She was in the living room. I could hear her breaths from where she sat, harsh, nasal sounds, as if her nose was blocked. When Father had a cold, he'd always breathe through his mouth, big, labored breaths, and he wasn't used to it. When people mentioned my face, I always touched it, trying to work out why it was so strange to them. When I asked if I could touch theirs, there was always a pause. I guessed sighted people never did that. Why would they need to? When I asked Ellie if I could touch her face, she reluctantly agreed, but moments later, Father entered the room and asked me who I was speaking to. I told him nobody. He would always punish me when I spoke about them. I think it scared him. He'd take my arm and march me off. I'd be knocked off balance and disoriented to the point where he'd finally set me down. My hands would frantically search my surroundings until I knew where I was. It was usually my bedroom.
every now and then he'd leave me outside in the middle of nowhere. That was the worst. I would be lost and scared. He told me about the road that ran in front of our house, and some sounds I heard were cars. They'd kill me if they touched me. Those sounds were all I had to know where I was. I waited to hear, and then I knew which way to turn to run back to the house. I heard Ellie that evening. She whispered to me, saying she was scared. I'd whisper back, but she didn't hear. I asked Father about Ellie. He didn't want to talk about her. I asked him why. He didn't reply. When I told him she asked about my face, he asked me what I did. I told him I wanted to touch hers. He laughed, though I knew he wasn't happy. I could hear the difference. When you laugh for pleasure, your mouth is wide open. When you pretend, your mouth is almost closed. To me, the difference was obvious. It wasn't until I was older that he explained. He said we lived in a special place, connected to the other world, that sometimes dead people slipped through, people who died in pain and wanted to reach the living. He explained that because I couldn't see, I was able to tune into that they knew I was listening when others weren't. He said I had to ignore it, otherwise they'd latch onto me forever and never leave me, that all the dead wanted was to be alive again. It was dangerous. They would trick me. He said he knew how to deal with them, but he couldn't help me if they became attached to me. Alex appeared to me a few years later. She told me that she was lost and didn't know where she was. I told her I wasn't allowed to speak to her, but she pleaded for help. I kept quiet, knowing what would happen if I said anything. "Did you speak to them?" Father asked. Though I was upset, I told him no. I wish I could have helped her, though. I knew what it was like to be lost, and it scared me. Alex didn't whisper to me at all. I'd ignored her, and she ignored me. Father saved me. I was thankful. After Alex, I knew what I needed to do, so I did it. They stopped bothering me after that for a very long time. That was until Sarah appeared. Sarah didn't give me a chance to be quiet. I was on my own, sitting in the living room and listening to the television. "Help," she said. "I need to find a way out." I stayed silent. "You can hear me, can't you?" she said, surprised. I'm not allowed to speak to you," I told her. "Please," she begged. "I'm scared. I'm lost. I want to see my daddy." I gripped the arms of the chair, telling her I wasn't allowed. "He's dead," she said, and I didn't answer. "Your father is dead," she said again. I wasn't going to fall for it. I heard banging from around the room as things began to fly and the shelves began to shake. "Stop it," I shouted, and it did. "Please help me," she said again. I wasn't going to talk to her. I did the only thing I thought would help. I unlocked the front door, hoping she'd run out and get lost, just like I would do. When I heard no more from her, I locked the door and sat back down. I listened intently for any signs she was still there. Except for the sounds of the TV, it was silent. I hated when my heart raced. I became all too aware of the tick-tock feeling rise and fall within my chest, like it was about to explode. When I heard my father's voice, I screamed. "Son," he said, I need your help. I think I'm dying." I did what he told me to do, and I didn't speak. If he did die, he'd never leave me. Instead, I raced out into the open air and shouted for help. I shouted until my voice was hoarse. I heard the sounds of cars that raced along the road in front of my house. I shouted until I heard someone respond. It was a woman. "What's wrong?" they asked. I told them I thought my father was dying. They asked what had happened to my face. I pleaded with them for help, and they promised they would. Sometime later, the woman returned to me. I was sitting on the grass, and she asked if she could hold my hand. "I'm so sorry," she told me. I heard the sounds of sirens and the sounds of people rushing. I asked what was going on. The woman said she was there for me. As the noise died down, a man asked me a question. "I'm a paramedic," he said. "What happened to your face?" I told him I was fine. He asked if I was sure, and I told him I was. He asked if I minded him touching my face. I said it was okay. I screamed and asked what he was doing. He told me everything was going to be okay, and the woman squeezed my hand, saying to be brave. I felt a pressure release from around my forehead, and the air felt cold against my skin. It sounded as if they were peeling an orange. I imagined in my head and worried he'd expose my insides. I didn't know what I was experiencing. I felt a tight pain within my head, like when you kick your shin against something hard, and then something I've come to understand as bright. It hurt so much I began to cry. "What happened to your eyes?" the paramedic asked. I said I was blind. He asked to check them. The pain returned when he examined them. "Do you know him?" he asked. The woman told him I was screaming for help and she came, and she didn't know me. "How long have you had the eye injury?" he asked. I told him I was blind from birth. He asked me if I could see his fingers. I told him no. He asked me if I could open my eyes. I said I didn't know what he meant. He asked me if I could open them. I didn't respond. I felt his fingers on my face, fingers covered in something rubbery. Then the brightness again. I screamed. He tried to calm me. The woman squeezed my hand again. I didn't know what was going on. Things I couldn't describe came to me. It was like it always was, but 100-fold, so much more real. I carried on screaming as a fuzzy form came into view. "Just breathe, okay? Everything will be fine." "When was the last time you saw?" the paramedic asked. As my heart began to calm and my breathing slowed, I was distracted by what I was experiencing. It overwhelmed me. I wanted to cry, and I did. "How long has it been?" he asked again. "I've never seen anything before," I told him. I was told to keep the eye mask on for most of the day, only taking it off at night at first to allow my eyes to adjust. I had been staying with my uncle and aunt, and I didn't even know I had. They were shocked at what had happened to me and that I hadn't been to school. It's been a roller coaster ride. The doctors said I may never get my perfect vision, though I will take what little vision I have. It's a godsend. I've been learning to read and write for the past few years. Sorry if my English isn't brilliant. It's the best I can do. I've been asking my aunt what happened to my father, but she always says he died of a heart attack. I asked what type of man he was. She says he was her brother, and she'll always love him no matter what. My uncle doesn't want to talk about him at all. I've been using the computer a lot lately, and really enjoying the internet. I can't believe there is such a thing. After being so lonely for so long, I can talk to whomever I want, whenever I want, though I am wary of that. How do I know if who I'm speaking with is alive? No one seems to worry about that like Father did. Someone asked me today who I was. I was on a forum talking about the spirit world. I was so happy to find people who I could relate to. They sent me a link. They asked if I was the same person. It was an article on a true crime website. It was about my dad. They mentioned me by name, that I was bound so I couldn't see, that my mother had gone missing soon after my birth, that my father always wanted a daughter. They found 14 bodies in the basement. They said one got away, a girl by the name of Sarah Frank. She was the one to call the police. They supposed he parked the car around the back of the house. That's where they found it. He carried them into the basement via the storm entrance, where he'd leave them. Sarah had managed to get away after she agreed to be his daughter, following 4 days of sustained torture. She then stabbed him with a kitchen knife he'd placed on the counter to butter some toast. I didn't want to believe it, and I'm not sure I would have if it weren't for the names of the victims. 2 stuck out, Ellie Farmer and Alex Riddle, but I'd spoken to them in the living room. To this day, I wonder if my father was honest with me about one thing in his life. Did I speak to them before or after he killed them? The Time I Saw Stephen King at a Little League Game by N.S. Lewis. This is one of those memories that just comes flooding back. You've gone years and years not thinking about it at all, and then something triggers it, and boom, the floodgates open, and you're back there, watching it all happen again. In this case, my wife triggered the memory. She works at a small law firm up the coast a bit, and on Friday she came home and related an anecdote that her boss's wife, Cheryl, had told her. At the time, Cheryl was going to UMO, which is the main state college. I think this was the 70s or maybe the 80s. I don't remember if she was at the gym on campus or at a different one around town. Anyway, there she was, running on the treadmill, and Stephen King walked right up to her, raised his arms in the air and said, "Boogadaboo." Then he started shaking his face really fast and making weird noises. After that, he just walked off, leaving her bewildered and creeped out. I'm a big fan of Stephen King, as I imagine most people here are, so I got a pretty big kick out of the story. My wife sort of acted it all out for me, and I started picturing it in my head. And that's when it hit me. I was, I think, 11 years old. My dad was the Little League coach, and I was in the dugout, out of commission with a broken wrist. It was just as well, because I really sucked at baseball. Every time I was at bat, I'd swing for the fences and end up whiffing it about 98% of the time. I tried pitching one time and let up like 5 homers in 2 innings, and it was so bad that the old man had to pull me out. Anyway, it was between innings, and the guys came into the dugout, and one of them said, "Look, that's Stephen King in the bleachers." I looked over, and sure enough, there was Stephen King, sitting in an empty section of the bleachers. I knew who he was, so I thought it was cool, but I wasn't a fan then. I actually avoided horror altogether until I was in my mid-20s, and the reason I did so was because of Stephen King. When I was a kid, my older brother had a sleepover, and they watched It, the miniseries on TV, which was airing at the time. I heard them talking about how scary it was, with the giant spider and the evil clown and everything, and I got freaked out and stayed right away from horror for a long time. And by the way, I recently watched that version, and while it was neat, I can't imagine actually being scared by it unless you're a little kid. Back to the story. Everyone just kind of minded their own business and focused on the game, respectfully giving Mr. King plenty of space. I did wonder what the hell he was doing there. I lived in Belfast, Maine, and I knew that he lived in Bangor. Maybe he had a kid in Little League and was scoping out the competition for when the All-Star game started. I sadly never got close to making the All-Star team. Or maybe he was researching for a story or something like that. I knew he did a lot of stuff with kids as the main characters, so I didn't know why he was there, and I'd look at him every so often just to confirm. Yep, that's Stephen King. I was glad that I wasn't in the game, so somebody famous like him didn't see what would inevitably be a big swing and miss strikeout for me. Then I looked over one time, and he was gone. At some point, I had to take a whiz, so I headed back to the porta potties. That's when I saw Mr. King again, chowing down a hot dog at the concession stand. Cool, I thought. I saw Stephen King eat a hot dog. I did my business and headed back out to the dugout. When I got there, I looked around, and it looked like everybody had frozen. Like everybody was there, but stopped in whatever position they were in when it had happened. Mark Sanderson, the Yankees pitcher, was in the middle of the wind-up. His dad was leaning forward on the bleachers, looking intent on the pitch. I shook my head and blinked my eyes hard. When I opened them, it was the same. Everyone was just frozen. My dad was there next to me, looking at his clipboard, also frozen. It was nuts. Then I saw somebody who wasn't frozen. Mr. King walked out onto the field. He was carrying a clipboard of his own. He stopped in front of Sammy Gildhart, our runner on second, and started looking him over, writing things down on his clipboard. I didn't know what the hell was going on, and sort of settled into a corner of the dugout and watched. Mr. King lifted Sammy's batter's helmet up and knocked on his head. Then he replaced the helmet and jotted something down. He walked over to the Yankees' third baseman, a big bruiser named Greg Thompson. Mr. King walked in a slow circle around Greg and wrote at his clipboard for a while. What the hell is going on? I wondered. Then Mr. King pulled something from a pouch on his belt. It was one of those multi-tool things. He flipped it open to what looked like a serrated knife, and then started sawing Greg's head open. I let out a burst of puke and saw Mr. King's head turn slowly in my direction. I pretended to be frozen like everyone else. I prayed that he wouldn't notice the dribble of puke dripping down my chin. Mr. King turned back to his work, and I watched in shock and horror as he reached into the now opened-up top of Greg's head. He pulled a bit of brain out like a noodle and slurped it up. He chewed it slowly, then made a note on his clipboard. When he was done with that, he replaced the top of Greg's head and moved on to Mike Grangeley, our man at bat. He cut open Mike's chest and had a bite of his heart. Again, he chewed slowly and thoughtfully, and again he made copious notes. Then he put Mike back together and started walking off the field. As he was passing by the dugout, he stopped. He turned and looked right at me. I was trying to stay still as I could, but I'm sure I was shaking in fear. I watched helplessly as Mr. King raised his arms in the air and started shaking them.
"Boo-ga-da-boo,"
he said, and then started jiggling his face around, making snarling noises. I let out a yelp. I couldn't help it, and I couldn't help but reflexively covering my mouth. Mr. King winked at me and then walked off into the parking lot. When he got there next to his car, he snapped his fingers and the game suddenly resumed. Mark Sanderson released a fastball down the middle that went right past Matt Grangeley. Mark's father let out a whoop from the stands. So that was the time that I saw Stephen King. It was very weird, and I guess I sort of repressed the memory, though in the end everything was fine. Remembering that does answer the question that I've been wondering ever since I got into horror and started devouring King's work. How the hell does he do it? How does he create such vivid characters? Now I know, and so do you.
I woke up at summer camp as a janitor of sorts. The camp is situated on a secluded island, so there is no flowing water and no electricity outside of the small town. I lived there during the summers, maintaining the facilities and cleaning up after the kids. Boring, I know, but the pay is fair, and I don't have much to do. The only time I ever met a group was the first year the camp was held in 20 years. It was the summer of 2002, late August. It was hot, and the group was very large. To celebrate the last night of camp, some of the older kids had snuck out, silently moving through the palm trees to escape watchful eyes. It was the middle of the night, and the moon was high in the sky, shining with a pale light, making the soft waves sparkle with life. By chance, they had set camp just outside of my cabin. The noise from their speakers and their shouting woke me from a drowsy, alcohol-induced sleep. I dressed and found them dancing and drinking by a blazing fire. I brewed a pot of coffee and waited for them to leave so I could go back to sleep. An hour passed, and their shouting and dancing had quieted down. The music faded away, and the fire was less fierce, but still burning, hot and red. I could see most of them gathering around the flames, speaking softly. Great, I thought. I can finally go back to sleep. But alas, 2 of the older girls, maybe 15 or 16, approached my cabin. One of them wore a flower-patterned bikini, and the other a pale summer dress. It was hard to discern its color in the darkness. The one in the bikini approached my door, while the other girl hesitated and stayed a few feet back. I went up to the door and opened it, just before she had a chance to knock. She shrieked, a loud and high-pitched shriek that only a teenage girl can make. The sound made me grit my teeth. She almost fell backwards, but her friend caught her, and both of them began to giggle.
We thought this was the Ropemaker's house,
the one in the dress said, smiling shyly.
We didn't think anyone actually lived here.
Well, I'm only a janitor. I paused to yawn, still tired and sleep-deprived. The legend of the Ropemaker was just a story we used to tell children. It was about morale, work ethics, and how dedication would lead to success. I vaguely remembered the story from my own youth.
Do you know anything about the legend of the Ropemaker?
The girl in the bikini asked, with a childish curiosity. I frowned at her. Why were they asking this? I was getting impatient, wanting nothing more than to lie back down in my own bed and read. Maybe I do, and maybe I don't. Sure, I lived here about 30 years ago, but I was only a kid a few years younger than you girls. What do you know about the Ropemaker, anyway? I asked in an irritated tone,
Only that he died horribly.
said the one in the dress.
They say that he was drowned here.
The other continued.
Would you tell us?
They both asked eagerly, almost skittish.
Please, pretty please.
The girls pleaded, looking at me with big, hopeful eyes. After a deep sigh, I agreed, and they took me by the hand and almost dragged me to the fire. The girls shouted at their friend to quiet down. Teenagers of all shapes and sizes were staring at me, sitting around the fire. An older boy stood. He was smoking a cigarette but threw the butt in the sand and began arguing with the girls, saying that an old man was not welcome at their party. The girls would have none of it, and made him sit down like the rest and keep his mouth shut. They were all waiting for a story. I could tell by the look in their eyes that they were not expecting a story about morale and duty. They were wanting a horror story. And so I decided to tell a story so terrifying that none of them would ever return to disturb my peace again. So, you want to know about the Ropemaker? I asked in a hushed voice. Most of them nodded or agreed, but some of them looked away, like they didn't care at all. I warn you, I almost whispered now, it is not a story for children. Are you sure about this? Just tell your story, old man, the older boy said in a nonchalant tone that implied that he was not going to be frightened by some janitor's ancient story. I almost felt sorry for them. But nevertheless, I began telling my story. The legend began 30 years ago in a small village that used to be right here, on this very island. The villagers had been living in fear for years and years, never leaving their houses alone, or daring to sleep without their doors locked and bolted, fearing they might never wake again. For there was a serial killer among them. A wolf who had made his way into the herd, and the herd was beginning to thin. No one trusted their friends, colleagues, or neighbors. Both girls and boys alike would be found hanging by their necks from palm trees, their corpses mutilated. The mutilation varied each time. At first the killer would take a finger or toe, maybe an ear. But as he grew bolder, he took eyes, tongues, even genitals. He always kept the parts for trophies.
So, who was he?
The girl in the dress asked. I'm getting there, I replied. Just let me tell the story. The bodies would be found hanging from a tree beside the Ropemaker's house, I continued. The villagers grew suspicious of the Ropemaker, but could not prove he was the killer. After 3 years and over 50 murders, the desperate and fearful mayor decided to act. The island had become infamous for its serial killer, and tourists no longer came. He decided to sentence the Ropemaker, who was just an old man who day in and day out worked on his ropes. He was seemingly harmless, and all agreed he was the kindest old man. But something had to be done. Someone had to pay. They arrested him and tortured him for weeks, trying to get a confession, but to no avail. Between his screams, he would plea his innocence. But they would not listen. In their last attempt to make him confess, they tied his feet to a rock, with rope he was forced to make. Then they carried him out to the beach, just by the edge of the water, and buried the heavy rock in the soft sand. To confess or slowly drown by the inevitable tide were his only options now. The entire village came to see the killer confess. They even forced the ropemaker's son to watch as his father would tear at the rope with his nails, ripping them apart. The old man would cry for help, for mercy, but when no one answered, he shouted curses at them. He threatened and screamed, he pleaded and begged, but no one answered his cries. The hours passed and the water slowly rose. Desperate to escape, he tried to bite off his own foot. He would scream between the bites, tearing away flesh and tendons. However, he could no more get through his bone than he could his rope. In a last attempt, he tried to break his bone with his hands, but he could not do it. The pain was too great. His terrifying screams of agony and despair can still be heard to this day. If you listen closely at night, you can hear it in the distance. He was drowned and buried right here, under the water right beside us. The moon was high and full that night too. The ropemaker made the rope that would be his death, with as much care and pride as all the others he had made before. And it would not budge or tear, no matter how hard he struggled. As the sun finally set, all the villagers were crying for the old man, ashamed of themselves for what they had done. Women and men, children and old people all cried, for the man and for themselves. The killer had not been found. The only one who didn't cry was the ropemaker's son. He just sank to his knees and stared out at the horizon, eyes empty and cold. Even though the man had never confessed the murders seemed to have stopped. "So the ropemaker was the killer?" a younger boy with big black eyes asked. "No one knows," I answered. "Wow, that was a great story," said the boy who at first had argued. "Let's go take a midnight swim," he shouted to the group. Many of the other kids started to rise and follow him. "Wait!" I almost shouted. They all instantly stopped at the loudness of my voice and sank back down. "Don't you want to know how the story ends?" I asked. They all nodded. The fire was almost out at this point. Just an orange glow remained. I continued my story. Months passed, even years, without any sign of the killer. Soon, the world forgot about the incident, and the summer camps began again. They thrived for a couple of years, until something happened during their last summer camp before this one.
What happened?
Someone whispered softly. The last camp before this one was 20 years ago, and about 10 years after the ropemaker's death. The mayor, who had sentenced the ropemaker, had retired, and his children were taking part in the summer camp as counselors. Since it was the 10th year of camps, they decided to make it bigger and moved it farther away from the village. To celebrate the last day of the last week, a feast was held right where you are sitting now. A giant bowl of punch was brought out by the fire. Food and drink shared between happy teenagers, just like you. Even the counselors took part in drinking. Happy shouting and joyful music could be heard late into the night. Little did they know what gruesome fate awaited them. The next day, the sun rose and the sun set, without any of them returning. The mayor worried about his children, decided to walk out to the beach where the feast had been held. What he found drove him mad. It is said that he simply continued walking into the sea to drown his sorrow and his life. It took yet another day for the locals to find the scene, and it was so terrifying, the entire village abandoned the island within the year. Hanging from a tree, one rope tied to each limb like a marionette, was the mayor's daughter. Her head had been cut off. It was found by the beach, sitting on a pile of rock, beside a corpse so mutilated it was not considered human. Arms and fingers twisted in cruel torture, and her entire body was covered in stabs and cuts. Her face was the worst of it. Her eyes had been gouged out, and then someone had poured acid into them, burning her entire face beyond recognition. On her forehead, carved all the way to the bone, was the text, "Mutilator." All the locals who had been working as counselors were tied, hand behind their backs, with a thick rope in their mouth, their kneecaps smashed and broken. Unable to move by themselves, they had been left there to watch the waves crashing against them, just barely reaching their feet. When they had been found, they were all sent to the hospital in town. None of them ever spoke of what they had been forced to witness. Later, they had found the corpses of the participants on the beach, tied to rocks and drowned by the tides. Most of them had been eaten by carnivorous fishes, but some had clear bite marks on their legs, just above where the noose had been tied. The locals say it was the spirit of the Ropemaker who did it. Others claim it was the gods. No one remains who lived through that incident. Most of the counselors who survived died soon thereafter from infections or dehydration. The few that lived later committed suicide by hanging. They never found the Ropemaker's son. He had vanished the day of the incident, never to be seen again for 20 years. And now the legend has almost been forgotten. Maybe someone needs to remind the world again. As I finished my story, I looked around. No one spoke for a minute. Nothing but a soft rustling of leaves and the nearby waves gushing against the beach. I could see the terror in their faces. They would not be swimming this night, and probably not for many nights to come. I slowly stood. The soft glow from the burnt-down fire was slowly dying. I drew in my breath and exhaled as hard as I could, right at the ashes. Smoke rose, and the little light that had been remaining faded in an instant. In the pitch-black darkness, girls and boys screamed and ran in all directions. I just stood there, laughing like a maniac. So that's the story of how I'm not allowed within 500 yards of any summer camp-related activities.
This all started a few weeks ago. I will give you a little background first. I met my girlfriend just after college, and we have been together for a little over 7 years. We currently live in a 2-bedroom cottage in our hometown. It's very rural where we live, and it takes around an hour to get into the city. We both work in the city, but I work a couple of days a week from home as well. The company my girlfriend works for is a non-profit charitable organization. She works in the social media department, and their main ethos is to encourage positive change. The videos they promote are usually quite uplifting videos. They share a lot of them, but also create their own. This means that she will occasionally appear in the videos, if they are interviewing someone or acting something out. A few weeks ago, she told me to check out one of the videos where she had interviewed someone. I watched the video and then decided to read some of the comments. I'm not a very jealous person, but I kind of wanted to know what people were saying, specifically about her. Pretty harmless, I thought. The comments were fairly mundane at first, the usual fight the power type of responses. I became a bit obsessed and kept scrolling through. There was the occasional misogynist comment, but nothing I didn't expect. That was until I found a few comments that unsettled me. The original comment had around 10 likes and had a number of other accounts. The message said, "We cannot wait for you to join us. You are perfect." I clicked on the replies, and the accounts that they had been tagged with had all replied. The messages ranged from stating that she was the perfect match for their group to openly discussing what type of underwear they thought she was wearing. This was discussed in quite some detail. I figured it was just a bunch of desperate guys, until I read another reply. It said how he had watched her eating her lunch in the park yesterday. He wanted to go up to her and introduce himself, but knew that was not part of the rules. He described in detail what she was wearing. It was exactly what she wore yesterday. I contacted my girlfriend immediately to tell her about this and advised her to delete the comments and contact the admins of the site. I also looked through the previous videos and saw that these comments were frequent on the videos she appeared in. They were always the same and always mentioned her joining them and how she was exactly what they wanted. They were all throwaway accounts, with the only friends being the people that were tagged in the comments. The accounts fortunately were reported to the site admins, and we heard nothing more about it for a couple of weeks. That was until late last week. I received a phone call from my girlfriend while she was working from home. "Well, that was unexpected, but how did you get them to agree to putting that?" she said in a giddy tone. Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean. Is everything okay?" I said, confused. "The flowers, silly. I love them. The note was a bit naughty, though. What if my colleagues saw that?" she said, chuckling down the phone line. "What do you mean? I did not send flowers." "If not you, who then?" What did the note say? Maybe they're from your mum." "No." She paused, then continued. "The note said, roses are red, violets are blue. I'm using my hand, but thinking of you." What the hell? Call the police. That is disgusting," I said, standing up, almost throwing my phone across the room. She sounded shaken up and abruptly ended the call, telling me she was going to contact the police. I drove up to her office that evening to pick her up, rather than her getting the train. I was terrified at the thought of someone following her once she left the office. The police took the letter in as evidence. They also looked through the comments to see if they could trace the comments back to the people behind the accounts. The flowers had not been sent through a company or courier service, which means that one of these men must have hand-delivered them to the front desk. We were both shaken up the way home and barely spoke about the incident in the car. Her boss told her to work from home for the rest of the week until everything calmed down. We did not hear anything after the first few weeks, and her boss told us that nothing else had arrived at the office. We went to see the family this weekend to try and take our minds off things. We arrived back home a few hours ago, and something immediately felt off. The house itself seemed untouched. but the back garden gate was left wide open. I entered the house cautiously and searched the whole house, but found nothing. I went to the back of the cottage and noticed some marks on the back window. It looked as if someone had been clasping their hands together to look inside. We debated calling the police, but were tired and could not prove anything. We also live quite far away from the nearest police station, so it would take them quite a while to get here. We closed all the curtains and made sure the place was locked up and headed to bed. I kept the phone next to my nightstand on speed dial, and just in case had my trusty bat at the side of the bed. I could not sleep much, so decided to head into the living room and watch some television. I was about to call it a night when I heard some commotion coming from the front of the cottage. I hesitantly walked over to the window and pulled the curtains back slightly. It was pitch black, but I could make out a number of hooded figures standing around 15 feet from the house. They were all swaying in sync with each other and chanting something unintelligible. I opened the curtains a little more to get a better look at them, and as I did, I saw the figures stop chanting and stare directly at me. In the brief moment I looked over at them, I saw their faces. They were men, but their faces were void of any emotion at all. They were completely blank as they stared at me, as if staring through me. I quickly pulled the curtains back in pure terror and stumbled across the hallway back into the bedroom. I grabbed the phone, waking my girlfriend up in all the commotion. She groggily awoke, asking me what was wrong. I told her I would explain in a minute and called the police. As I was speaking to the operator, I heard the chanting start up once again. I turned away for a brief moment to grab my bat when I noticed the chanting had stopped again. I turned around to see my girlfriend peering outside the window. She was completely motionless as I shouted at her to get away from the window. She turned to me, her eyes wide, her face pale in fear. She wanted to scream, but could not formulate a response. I walked over to her and pulled her towards me. She pushed me away slightly and motioned at me to look. The operator asked me to explain what was happening and to stay on the line, but I could not speak. I looked outside the window at the men, who were now perched on their knees. They were performing some kind of sick prayer or ritual. They were making strange hand gestures in an almost dance-like fashion. They were no longer in sync with each other and were all creating different symbols with their hands. The men gradually got back to their feet and huddled in a circular formation. They broke apart, and one of the men appeared from the center of the circle, holding a large, plain white box. He held it above his head before placing it gently in front of the cottage. They performed one final chant before turning around and slowly fading off into the distance. We are sitting here waiting for the police to arrive. I would leave, but I am terrified that they are still out there. They should be here soon. I have no idea who these people are. I have no idea how they found out where we live. And I have no idea what is in that box. And I am certain I don't want to know.
The town of Pleasanton is just a little too perfect. Part 1. We're out of gas. The 4 most terrifying words you can hear when you're barreling down the highway through an empty desert. Don't worry though, we've got an exit coming up. Pleasanton,
1 mile. I don't see anything from here, I said, scanning the empty land. What if it leads us 50 miles in the wrong direction? He laughed. It's this, or breaking down on the side of the road, Sweet Pea. Your choice. I took one look at the buzzards circling overhead and told him to turn. But as soon as we got there, my heart sank. It was one of those towns. You know the kind, where rich women spend their Sundays buying a whole lot of nothing with their husband's money, where bed and breakfasts are the norm, Wi-Fi is unheard of, and you have to pay $5 for a cup of coffee, and where gas stations are non-existent because they're an eyesore. I don't see a gas station, I said. Relax. I'm sure there's one around here somewhere. The flag above Linda's salon flapped noiselessly in the wind. The tables outside Cafe Italiano stood empty under a striped awning. A train sat in the distance, visible through a narrow alley, but no gas station. Maybe we should ask someone. If you can find someone, sure. Because despite the town's quaint charm, despite the perfectly manicured grass, the freshly painted siding, the myriad of shops, we had yet to see a single soul. The road teed, and Brandon swung right. This street looked the same as the last, except for the park, squashed between Elle's dresses and very berry pies. It was perfect, like the rest of the town, as if ripped from a painting. The green grass rippled in the wind. The pond was still and glassy, reflecting the cloudless sky above. Brandon took another left. And then, somehow, we were back on the same road again. Linda's salon, Cafe Italiano, all exactly as we left them. Even the train was parked in the same spot as before. We went in a circle. Good job. Let's stop and get our bearings. We rolled to the curb. I pulled out my phone. A quick glance at maps would tell us where we were, where the nearest gas station was. I was staring back at a black screen. My phone was dead. Mine's dead too, Brandon said. But I could have sworn I charged it before we left. Oh, just like you could have sworn you filled the tank? He sighed. Come on, this was supposed to be a fun trip, for our anniversary. Don't ruin it with a petty fight. Petty? We're stranded in the middle of some backwoods town, out of gas, and it's your fault. But I took a deep breath and nodded. Brandon swung the door open. Let's go to the bakery. Ask someone there. I heaved myself out of the car. As soon as I did, a gust of wind blew through my hair, flipping it over my face. Great. But as I made my way over, Brandon was frowning. It's empty. I looked in the window. There sat a beautiful array of baguettes, rolls, and loaves, crispy golden crusts that I could almost taste, layers of cinnamon sugar, perfectly applied, as if by a paintbrush, nuggets of nut and raisin dotting the surfaces. But as fresh as the breads looked, there wasn't a baker in sight, or customers to enjoy them. And when I took a deep breath in, it wasn't the buttery smell of fresh bread that filled my nose, but the acrid burn of paint and plastic. Let's go down this way, he said. We've got to run into somebody at some point, right? Begrudgingly, I followed him back out into the sidewalk. After a few minutes, we rounded the corner, and the park came back into view. It looked even more perfect up close. The violets swayed in the wind. The leaves shuddered, shifting the shadows across the grass, making it appear like the ground itself was moving. The pond glimmered brightly as ever, the reflection undisturbed by ripples. Almost too perfect. "Do you want to check it out?" Brandon asked. "I thought we were looking for people to get out of this place. But look, it's so pretty." "Fine." We walked across the street, my coat billowing out behind me. I undid the lock on the gate and stepped inside. "This is kind of nice," I conceded. A gust of wind blew across my face, sending a clump of hair into my mouth. I sputtered, and then I realized what was wrong. Despite the wind, the pond didn't have a single ripple. I ran towards it, kicking up dirt behind me. "Caroline? What?" But I ignored him, running across the grass as fast as I could. I fell to my knees, took a hand from my pocket, and stretched it out to the water. My fingers hit a smooth, solid surface. "It's not water. It's glass." He stooped and hit it with a heavy hand. "What?" He stared at me, wide-eyed. What in the world? I stumbled over to a cluster of violets, but my fingers fell upon bumpy, hard stems, not smooth, supple ones. "Plastic," I said, running them over my thumb. "They're plastic." "What? It's all fake?" I leaned against the oak tree. It groaned and creaked under my weight. "I think the tree is fake too." "But why?" "I don't know. It's so weird, isn't it?" "More like disturbing. But..." He stopped, his eyes locked onto the shop to our right. I followed his gaze. In one of the shop windows stood a woman, watching us. I ran out of the park, across the perfectly clean sidewalk, to the front of Elle's dresses. "Hello?" I yelled, banging on the glass. But the woman was gone. "Maybe we should just forget it. It doesn't seem like she wants to talk to us," Brandon says behind me, his voice jittery. "Do you want to get out of this town or not?" I spat. "Hello? Excuse me?" I shouted, banging harder. Behind the shaking glass, the lavishly dressed mannequins stared at us with blank faces, as if silently judging us. I tried the door. Locked. Then I cupped my hands over the windows and gasped. Behind the dress forms, there was nothing, just a large, empty room. No dresses, no clothes, no inventory at all. "It's not a real store," I said. "Just a facade. The sharp whistle of the train. I looked up. In the distance sat the train, in the same place as before. I wonder... It took us 20 minutes to walk to the station. When we finally got there, it was my turn to be disturbed. There were no train tracks. Well, unless you count the crudely painted railroad ties on the asphalt. No wonder I hadn't seen it move since we first arrived. It was a train sitting on flat ground. "We shouldn't go any closer," Brandon said, laying a hand on my shoulder. "This whole thing feels weird, like a..." He trailed off, fear flashing in his eyes. "Like what, Brandon?" "Like a trap." And then I heard it. Voices, chatting and laughing, coming from inside the train. I glanced at the windows. Within a few of them, I saw the dark silhouettes of people, contrasting starkly with the yellow light. "There are people in there," I said. "Maybe they can help us." I started towards it. "Caroline, no. We shouldn't." "What? You want us to walk around this town forever?" "No, but..." I wheeled around, the anger suddenly bubbling up inside me. "No. You know where I thought you were taking me. New York City, to see a Broadway show, or to climb the top of the Empire State Building." "Caroline..." "You said that's where we were going. You said it! But then you lost the game of poker with Greg, and suddenly the plans changed." I felt tears sting my eyes. "At least have the decency to admit it." "But..." "You find some stupid little bed and breakfast, and then to top it all off, you forget to get gas, and we wind up stranded in this dinky little town." I yanked away from him. With a deep breath, I climbed the metal stairs and pulled the door open. "Hello?" I called more loudly than I meant to. The yellow light flickered. Seats, upholstered with red fabric, flanked the aisle, but they were empty. The pockets of each seat back were also empty, as were the luggage racks overhead. "Hello?" Brandon stepped in behind me. "Okay, we'll explore this thing. Just let's try to make it quick, okay?" I ignored him and walked further down the aisle. "Hello?" I called again. The voices grew weaker, then stronger, then weaker, and every single seat was empty. "Hello?" My voice caught in my throat. There on the painted window was the silhouette of a man. "Caroline!" I whipped around. Brandon was standing by one of the seats, his face pale. I know where the voices are coming from. I rushed over. He was pointing frantically to something embedded in the arm of the chair. I crouched down to get a better look. "It's a speaker," I whispered. The sound reverberated through the metal of the train, shaking the floor underneath us. I looked up and through the window at the front. A shadow in the next car, coming towards us. We ran down the aisle, past the empty chairs, the silhouettes on the windows, the speakers and their recordings of chatter. The doors rolled open. A tall, thin man walked in, wearing a tuxedo and a mustache. As soon as his eyes met ours, he quickened his pace. "Caroline, stop staring and run!" Brandon pulled me out of the car. We ran down the street, past the fake trees, the glass pond, the empty shops. We ran until our legs ached, our lungs burned, our feet stung. "There, the church." We ran into the atrium. Brandon lifted the welcome sign and pushed it through the handles to barricade the door. "Let's get inside." He pulled open the door. No. The church wasn't empty. The pews were filled with mannequins, all formally dressed in suits and dresses and hats, turned towards the front of the church. And at the front was a woman. Or rather, the skeleton of one. It appeared she had died at least several years ago from the state of her body. But she was dressed in a new, crisp white wedding gown. She was propped up against the altar, as if waiting for her groom. "What the hell?" Brandon muttered. We walked down the aisle. The painted faces stared at us blankly. a blonde woman in a summer hat, her plastic hair trailing down her neck. A dashing man, eyes dull and black, wearing a stiff gray suit. "We should get out of here," I said. "It's only a matter of time before he finds us." A hand shot out from the pew and latched onto mine. I lost my balance. Pain shot through my knees. I screamed and tried to yank my hand away, but she was so strong, pulling me into the pew. I looked up. It wasn't one of the mannequins, but a woman, the same woman from the shop. In the light of the church, I realized she was quite young, maybe 20 at most. "We don't have much time," she said, yanking at my hand wildly. "When he gets here, he'll... She cut off. "I can protect you, I promise. Just come with me." Brandon shook his head. "It's another trap, just like the train." "I'm telling the truth," she yelled. "Then tell us the truth about everything," I said, stepping towards her. "Who is he? Why is everything fake?" She sighed. "He's my father." Brandon and I looked at each other. "My mother died 10 years ago. After she did, he got a little obsessed. He wanted to recreate their perfect wedding day, down to the small little town that they got married in." "Why not just move back to that town?" Brandon asked. "It had already changed significantly since that day. A Domino's, where Cafe Italiano used to be, a parking garage on top of the park." She threw a scared glance at the door. "Not to mention the tons of tourists visiting from the city every weekend." "Why doesn't he want to hurt us?" I asked. "I mean, we'll sit in on his little corpse wedding if it means he'll let us go." "No, he won't have it. People are imperfections according to him. This is his perfect town, and he wants no one messing it up. And..." She cut off. The doors of the church shook and shuddered, making a sickening, splintering crack each time they were hit.
"Let me in,"
a voice yelled from the other side.
"Let me in, V."
We followed her to the back of the church, down a dark set of stairs. The air grew thick and musty. Cold emanated from the stone walls. She led us through a few doors, locking each one as we went by. As we entered a narrower tunnel, we slowed down to a walk. "Walk that way. 30 minutes, you'll come up on the other side. There's a convenience store on the outskirts of Franklin. They'll give you a lift." "What about my car?" She stared at Brandon without a smile. "Don't come back for it." V was true to her word. In a half hour, we had surfaced on the other side, next to a mom-and-pop convenience store. While Brandon called for a ride, I stared out across the desert at Pleasanton, and in the distance, I heard the faint toll of wedding bells ringing out across the sand. After her husband left, all she did was cry. Cry, cry, cry. Noon, cry. 10 p.m., cry. 3 a.m., cry. Her pitiful bleating would pour through the thin wall between our apartments and drive me out of my mind. I couldn't sleep. My work suffered. I stared, eyes wide with restless hatred, at the ceiling in my uncomfortable bed as night after night was stolen from me. Pounding on the wall did nothing but cause her to cry harder. Called to the obese building superintendent brought castigation, naught to my neighbor, but to me.
How dare you be so heartless?
The super chided. In the rare cases she wasn't speaking around a mouthful of food, it still sounded as if she were.
Her husband has abandoned her.
Look, I can't sleep. I can't even think, I protested. The thing on the other end of the line huffed.
Get some earplugs,
she suggested, and hung up. This went on for months. Like any man in my situation, I reached the end of my rope, and in a way, so did my neighbor. 3 weeks ago, I knocked on her door. I was holding a bouquet of flowers. The teary wretch let me in. Her eyes were red, her nose was chapped and peeling. Used tissues littered the floor. Ugh, disgusting. When the door closed behind me, I was on her. She was tiny and weak, no match for a man of my stature, or a man of my strength. I produced a rope I'd hidden in my coat. I looped it around her neck and hanged her from a beam in the kitchen. Before I left, I placed a chair on its side underneath her. It was more effortless than I'd fantasized. After that, she didn't cry anymore. I slept like a baby for the first time in longer than I can remember. A few days later, I was sitting at my kitchen table, enjoying a meal in peace. I heard heavy footsteps coming down the hall. I knew those quaking footfalls. It was the monstrous superintendent. She stopped at the door and knocked. She waited a few minutes and knocked again, calling her name. When there was no answer, I heard a key in the lock. The door creaked open, and a few clomping steps later, I heard a scream. I was delighted. I'd been worrying the corpse would begin to stink up my apartment if too much time went by. The creature stopped screaming after a few seconds and galumphed out of the apartment and banged her meaty fists on my door.
Mr. Peel! Mr. Peel! Please let me in! Something terrible has happened!
I wiped my mouth and folded my napkin, then let the thing in.
Mrs. LaSalle hanged herself,
the superintendent bellowed. Her wet eyes bulged with shock. We should call the police, I proposed, doing a very passable impression of a surprised and saddened man. That poor woman. The police came and went. The superintendent told them all they needed to know. A suicide. Case closed. Problem solved. My following days were peaceful and productive. I slept easily and woke rested. For a time. The last few nights, my slumber has been disturbed by noises that, until recently, were far too soft to identify. They crept in on the edges of my hearing threshold, gentle but insistent, just enough to keep me from drifting off. I called the porcine superintendent and was unsurprised by her unwillingness to investigate.
Probably the pipes,
she belched and let the matter die at the hands of a dial tone. The other night, the sound was louder. I pressed my ear to the wall I'd shared with the sobbing wretch and heard nothing remarkable. I rose from my bed and walked through the house. Once in the kitchen, a whisper hissed like a rush of steam. Mr. Peel. I jumped and bristled. Who's there? I demanded. The whisper didn't repeat. I checked the door. It was still locked. The windows were shut. I made a final loop of the apartment, then returned to bed. My sleep was uneasy. Yesterday was uneventful. My day was productive, and night fell without incident. I went to bed without thinking of the previous night's whisper. Around 4 a.m., my sleep was again disturbed. It was that indefinable sound again. Now it was coming from the direction I recognized. It was the other side of the wall, my former neighbor's wall. I pressed the side of my head against the sheetrock and heard what I swear was laughter. Innocent, gentle laughter. In the darkness of night, however, the innocence of the sound was sinister, ominous. I knocked on the wall. "Who is there?" I asked. My voice was timid and demonstrated a weakness I loathed. There was no response aside from more laughter. The sound moved to other parts of the neighbor's apartment. My head ached from pressing it against the wall, but I needed to know who had the audacity to taunt me. Was it the disgusting superintendent? Had she gotten into the whiskey again? The laughter diminished as it moved into an area too far into the neighbor's apartment for me to hear from my bedroom. I got out of bed and went after it. It followed the wall we shared, and soon it was just on the other side of the front of the room. "Mr. Peel." The whisper came from outside my front door. I leapt to the peephole and looked through. No one was there. The laughter persisted. It was low now, and it rang through my apartment with such intensity my wine glasses rattled in their cabinet. "Who is it?" I shouted. "Who's there?" I swung open the door, ready to confront the bastard who dared terrorize me. The laughter ceased. The hall was empty. "Don't test me," I called to no one in particular. "Don't try." I backed in and slammed the door. My hands shook. I needed a drink. I passed through the front of my room into the kitchen, towards the liquor cabinet. I stopped in the doorway. Hanging on the beam in my kitchen was a rope. At its end, dangling like a rotting pear on a tree, was a noose. A single giggle came from the direction of the rope. "Soon, Mr. Peel," a voice hissed in my ear. "Soon." Cosmic Ants by Flared. Yesterday upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. When I was 6, I saw a man peering through my front door. He whispered to me, "Thanks." I had wet the bed a couple of minutes prior to this, and like most kids do, I walked over to my parents' bedroom for comfort. It was some time past midnight. I was stunned motionless, terrified on the inside, yet I didn't feel an immediate danger to myself. He closed the front door, and I hurried to my parents' bedroom. The next morning, my parents explained the concept of dreams seeping into reality when you're not quite fully awake. I didn't buy it. I didn't think about that event until much later in my life. My dad died a couple of years later of a heart attack. He was only 45. He was a good man. My mom raised me, and only me, from then on out. I tended to play by myself a lot, isolate myself, get caught up in those make-believe worlds in my own imagination. I was 13 when I noticed she had grown tired of me. Her eyes didn't light up when she talked to me anymore, or how I imagined it when I was younger. We weren't wealthy by any means, but after she lost her job and picked up the bottle, poverty was an arm length away. My birthday falls in the summer. All of my friends, all 2 of them, were on vacation during that day. I didn't really mind though, because I had a full day to myself. I was playing video games in by the basement on June 5th, my 16th birthday. I heard a shattering of glass upstairs, followed by a small silence, then heavy footsteps growing louder with each stride. A loud, quick slam of the basement door rung out, followed by scraping and shuffling along the other side. It was strange, I remember thinking. My mother was probably asleep. She slept a lot. No one else could get into our house, until I remembered of a decade prior when someone did. My dream. I grabbed my baseball bat and flung my scrawny body up the stairs, ready for anything, but the door was locked. The door does not have a lock. It most certainly does not have one on the outside of it. Something or someone must have been barricading the door. I took a couple of lunges at it, but the door probably did more damage to me than I did to it. Just before I was about to try and barge it down again, my ears went deaf, and I winced into a ball, almost falling down the stairs. The neighbors called the police. They heard it too, but not as clearly as I did. A policeman let me out of the basement to what I can only describe as a blur now. I was 16, but in that moment I was a baby again. A police officer carrying me out of the basement, shielding my ears until we were out of the house. Police cars and ambulances flooded my small driveway. I moved in with my aunt and uncle. They and the police all kept saying the same word: suicide. The funeral was a closed casket. Understandable. I'm not sure any gunshot wound to the head should have been an open casket. I didn't think she killed herself then. My mom wasn't happy, sure, but she wouldn't do that. I know there was someone else in my house that day. The police say my mom barricaded me in the basement, but I knew back then that wasn't true. I was right, and I know that today. I turned 22 last year. I was the sole inheritor of my mother's will, and while I finished high school and college, her house stood vacant. Now that I had some free time away from schooling, 6 months away after my birthday, I started the process of selling it. Selling it means bulldozing the lot. It's a small house built in the 60s that hadn't been lived in for 6 years, so there's no salvaging it. I drove up to meet the realtor for the first time. I hadn't been in that house, or even near it, since I was 16. It stood like an old woman, cracked and seeping with sadness, knowing its inevitable end was all too close. I was early. I paced up the walkway to the front door, not missing a beat. Of course, it was hard to come back, but I had the last 6 years of my life to think about this day and worry, so I was prepared. I inserted the key, twisted it, and reached out for the handle, cold and metallic in the January air. And just then, I had an incredible itch, an itch in the back of my skull. My hands tingled. I was unsure if it came from the cold or something else. I'm having a stroke, I thought to myself. I stood still, unable to shake the terror and nerves flowing through me. Something came over me though, and I opened the door. And just like that, the itch was scratched. I stepped inside, and it was warm. I heard the sounds of television, papers rustling, and drawers opening. To my left in the living room, a Christmas tree stood. The itch gradually returned and began to crawl up my spine to the back of my head again. Perplexed at what I was witnessing, I took a couple of steps forward. With each step, it was like watching a transition from a movie, almost like a time lapse. I could see my mother, my father, and I. With each swing of my leg, we would jump around the living room wearing different clothes, aging different times a day. Different seasons and different years would pass by. The itch did not falter, and I started walking faster through my house as the itch grew unbearable. I thought I was dying, and this was my life flashing before my eyes. As my pace grew faster, I felt more and more helpless with my steps, as if I wasn't in control. I was being bombarded with memories and smells and sights, and I felt like I was losing my mind, like the worst acid trip someone could be on. Something inside me told me to keep walking, but that damn itch just kept growing. I felt like there was some cosmic ants in my head tickling my brain and had no place in reality or the universe, and I didn't know where the heck I was, and that damn itch was getting worse and worse. I felt like I was floating, and each step felt like I was swimming through my own memories, while I was watching myself float away from Earth and the Milky Way in this dimension. My physical form was gone, and my body was spread across the universe. Until I wasn't. My feet planted. For the first time since the opening in the front door, I felt grounded. I felt stillness and tranquility momentarily. I felt like I didn't need to keep walking. I had my senses back. I stood in the kitchen and could hear the AC running. I could see Smirnoff bottles strewn across the counters. Some had made their way onto the floor. I saw my mom sitting in the only chair left in our living room. She was holding a shotgun, my dad's old shotgun. She was facing away from me, so still, almost like a statue. I wondered if time was frozen.
Mom?
I spoke through tight lips as my eyes began to well up.
Mom?
She could not hear me, or was pretending not to. I grabbed a Smirnoff bottle and smashed it on the ground in hopes to get her attention, but nothing. All of a sudden, I realized I heard the faint soundtrack from Mario coming from my left towards the basement. I turned back to my mom, who was now turning the shotgun towards herself. I felt sick and turned, knowing I didn't want to see this unavoidable end. And I didn't want to see it. I didn't want me to see it. Quickly, I leapt over to the basement door and slammed it shut. I took the bookshelf and dragged it over the door, setting up a small barrier. I ran out of the house as quickly as I could and slammed the door behind me. I heard no gunshot. I didn't hear anything from inside the house. I was grounded in reality once again. The cool January air swept across my body. I stood outside there for a moment, bewildered at the past couple of minutes, and let it all sink in. And once again, the tickle made its way to the back of my head. It wasn't harsh or demanding like it was before. It was almost nice in a way, an inviting numbness. I turned back towards the door and slowly opened it back up. I could feel the heat from inside once again, and now it was dark in the house. I could barely see the small boy coming down the stairs, then stopping in his tracks. I said the only thing I could think of then. Thanks. I'm a tutor. I went to a client's house today, and something is terribly wrong. By Blair Daniels. I met her on the internet.
My daughter needs help with Algebra 2. Please contact me ASAP.
Gina T. She gave me her address for an appointment, XX Laurel Court. Rolling up her long, wooded driveway, I couldn't believe my eyes. Her house was enormous, easily 5 times the size of mine. Carved columns rose up to the sky. 2 stone statues of lions flanked the front door. I grabbed the bronze knocker, carved in the shape of a boar's head, and swung it hard. For a minute there was complete silence. Then I heard the thumps of footsteps and the clink of the lock. "You must be Annie," said a short, plump woman with bright eyes. "I'm Gina." As I stepped in, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. The house was weirdly empty. The kitchen didn't even have a table. The living room had a single dusty sofa. The air was damp, cold, and musty, and all the lights were off. Only natural light pouring in from curtainless windows lit the place. "Just moved in?" I said, despite the lack of boxes. Yeah," she said hurriedly. "Yeah, we just moved in. Come on, Greta's in the study." She led me into a back room. A nervous-looking girl sat at the desk, her hands folded over a blank notebook. She was tall and lanky, with dark eyes and hair, unlike her mother. Greta didn't say much as we started the session. Since Algebra 2 classes begin with a review of Algebra 1, I wrote out some x equals mx plus b equations for her. She graphed the lines perfectly. Struggling? I thought. What kind of standards does this mother have? I'd tutored kids like that, where the mother thinks struggling is an A-, so I rolled with the punches and gave her some more questions. As her pencil scratched away, I looked around at the study. Like the rest of the house, it was mostly empty. The bookcase in the corner only held dust. Curiously, on the back door, there were long, indented lines that ran almost the entire height of it. Almost like scratches. "Where's your textbook?" I asked when I ran out of questions to give her. She looked around. "I don't have one," she replied. "You didn't buy one yet? Or the school didn't give you one yet?" "School?" she asked, eyes unblinking. "I don't go to school." Ah, a homeschooler. I'd dealt with them too. Generally they were smarter and a bit weirder than the public school kids, which fit Greta perfectly. I wrote out another equation and handed it to her. That's when the noise started. A high-pitched whine coming from outside the door. "What is that?" I said before I could stop myself. Greta didn't reply. Her pencil scratched quickly over the paper, working on the problem. "Greta?" She ignored me, scribbling furiously over the page. Her hair hung limply over her face, concealing her expression. Fear pounded through my body. "Greta, what is it?" She wordlessly slid the paper back to me. Under the chicken scratch of the X's and Y's were 6 letters. Get out. "Greta, what?" She held a finger to her lips and shook her head. When I didn't move, she leaned over to me and furiously wrote another word. Now. Stunned, I grabbed my bag. I walked over to the door, swung it open, stepped out into the hallway. That's when I understood. Gina, if that's even her real name, was in the kitchen. In her hand was a whirring, whining bone saw. The stove was on. The blue flame simmered. A greased metal pan sat over it, the oil sizzling and popping. I ran to the door. My thundering footsteps drew the attention of Gina. She looked up, her eyes wide with fright. Then she stepped towards me. I yanked the door open. I ran over the stone walkway, the damp grass, and didn't even stop until I was sitting in my locked car. Then I peeled out of the driveway and never looked back. By the time the police came, the house was empty. Well, emptier than it had been before. Greta and Gina were gone. The house, XX Laurel Court, had been abandoned for months, they told me. In the basement, the police made a gruesome discovery. 3 bodies were found. They were identified as local missing people, a professor, a teacher, a scientist. All of them were missing their brains.
I've been on no sleep for a while now, almost, I'll admit foolishly, desiring to experience something similar, a story to nervously recall around campfires and use as an icebreaker on awkward first dates. It wasn't until talking with an old friend, Gavin, this morning, that I realized I already have that story. It's just one of those things that never registers until your mind is led in its direction. Let me give you some background. Memories of 6th grade are hazy for me, as I'm sure they are for most of you. I went to a sort of specialty school, for lack of a better phrase, focused on education in outdoors and developing 6th graders' independence and self-reliance before entering into middle school and high school. I remember thousands of my city's kids applied for the 60 places. I was thrilled to get in. My mom was even happier. She saw the experience as something I desperately needed. I'd grown up without a dad. She told me he died before I was born. We never talked about it. She seemed to harbor some sort of hatred or bitterness towards my father, for whatever reason. Growing up, I always assumed she resented him for leaving her to raise me on her own. It seemed unfair to me, being as young as I was, but I didn't dare question her reasoning. We took a class camping trip late in the school year, May, I think, up in the north of the state. This week stands out in my mind. I can remember it all vividly, hiking and kayaking, even axe throwing and archery. It was a paradise for a 12-year-old. All 60 students had split up into partners, mine of course being Gavin, and each of these pairs sorted into groups around 10, led by a teacher or volunteer counselor. These groups would often rotate their activities and locations each of the 7 days, sleeping in the cabins a few nights, going on backpacking trips, and camping out in the woods another night. There were a few other specific experiences I can't remember. The night in question, however, remains clear in my memory. It was what we'd referred to as Survival Night, the legendary final test for us students. We were given a gallon of water, a tarp, a few matches, and a bag of food items, and sent off into the woods at least a mile away from the nearest other kids or teacher. Obviously, it wasn't meant to be hard, but back then, it had intimidated even the bravest of our class, Gav and I included. I remember we took turns trying to scare each other on the hike to the campsite. "You've got the matches, right?" I asked. Gavin feigned panic, frantically patting down his pockets and reveling in the fear that bloomed across my face before pulling them from his jacket. "Relax, man," he said, bursting into a fit of laughter. "Very funny. You really think I'd forgot the matches? I believe you're the one that's been losing everything.
He laughed. It was true. So far I'd managed to lose 4 or 5 articles of clothing, my journal, and my schedule of what days we'd be doing what. I was almost scared to go home and tell my mom about the clothes. So, what's the worst case scenario? What do you think? What? What do you think is the worst thing that could happen to us tonight? Ghosts? Maybe a bear? Ghost bears? Ghosts, definitely. I smiled. You're seriously comparing the two? Well, a bear would just kill you. Sure, it'd hurt, but after that, it'd be over, I said, cutting him off. Ghosts, well, that's a different story. They'd kill you and haunt you after you're dead. Ghosts can't kill people. And what kind of ghost would haunt another ghost? What's the fun in that? I'll tell you what kind of ghost. A vengeful one. I outstretched my arms and hung them over Gavin's head, letting out an ooh and wagging my fingers. Your ghost impression needs work, dude. Before we knew it, we were there. We draped the tarp over a low-hanging branch and gathered sticks and dead leaves for our fire. We already mutually agreed to keep the fire going and stay up through the entire night. That, of course, would take more wood than our 12-year-old minds had planned. We ran out around 11 p.m. I'll go look around there, said Gavin, shining his flashlight behind him into a grove of aspen trees. You check over there. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my jeans, and started towards the area he'd indicated. It wasn't long before I noticed it, a glimpse of bright red as I moved my flashlight. My adolescent curiosity took over, and I approached it. It was a backpack leaning against the trunk of a tall pine, one of those that looked perfect for climbing. I grabbed it without a second thought and examined it in the light. It was old and tattered, with rips in the nylon and missing zippers. Gav, I found something, I yelled over to him, dragging it to the fire. Check this out. He returned with an armful of sticks, letting them fall to the ground and approaching me. What is that? A backpack? That's not yours, is it? No, it was by a tree over there. That's so cool. Should we open it? Or... I don't know. Maybe it belongs to... I paused in the middle of the thought. Jack? In one of the rips, I caught a glimpse of something. It was the corner of a leather-bound notebook. But it couldn't be. Jack! Is that my journal? I whispered. What? What do you mean? I ignored his question, ripping the bag open to reveal a gallery of my things. My mind faltered. I felt waves of nausea and disbelief batter me from the inside. Dude, is that your hat? And that's our schedule? I don't remember much of what happened next. We sprinted to our assigned teacher's tent, struggling to explain it all coherently when we arrived. The police were called. Teachers and counselors led us out of the woods, and the next morning at breakfast, we were informed the trip had been cut short, and we were going home that day. I wish this story had a definitive ending, both for my sake and yours. What I can leave you with is Gavin and I's phone conversation from this morning. Does it bother you that they've never found the guy? That's a scary thought. Whoever he was, he had a hard-on for us especially. I spoke, letting out a little nervous laughter. What? What are you talking about? I felt my stomach sink. What are you talking about? Don't you think we would have been the first ones to know if they had? There was an uncomfortable silence before Gavin spoke again. Didn't your mom tell you? No. What? Tell me what? They definitely caught the guy. Arrested him the same night it all happened. Or rearrested, I guess. Gav chuckled. Again, there was a pause in conversation. You okay, Jack? Rearrested? I managed. Yeah, he was an escaped convict. Can you believe that? Oh, and you haven't even heard the craziest part. The guy had the same last name as you. What a coincidence, huh?